professor at the University of Montana Law School in the United States, and I'm excited to talk with you today about sex discrimination in US law. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get off and running. All right, so we have here a picture of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is a Supreme Court Justice here in the United States who passed away a few years ago. She was a champion of sex discrimination protection under US law, so I wanted to take a minute to identify her there. So let's talk about what we're going to do today. We're going to start by talking about the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution. And then we're going to look at application of the Equal Protection Clause to sex discrimination by the US Supreme Court in some seminal cases. Then we're going to talk about some examples. And my learning goals here today are to try to situate the Equal Protection Clause historically for you, understand where it came from in the history of the US constitutional tradition, see how it's applied by US courts, and then think about how it's applied differently than standards for race-based discrimination and other forms of discrimination. So let's start with a little bit of history. The US Constitution was ratified in 1788. And then just a couple years later, we had our Bill of Rights ratified. That was the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution. And that included the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment said, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That's our due process clause. But the due process clause only applies to the federal government. It doesn't apply to US states. So this is the provision that we look to when the federal government is alleged to have violated is alleged to have discriminated on the basis of sex. Then we had a civil war in the 1860s in the United States between the northern and the southern states, mostly with regard to the southern states' use of slavery. And then ultimately that led to the abolition of slavery. And in 1868, the ratification of what we call the Reconstruction Amendments, as we were reconstructing the Union of states in the United States. And this was the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the US Constitution. So the 13th Amendment prohibited slavery and involuntary servitude. And then the 14th Amendment is the Equal Protection Clause. So this is the amendment that we are really going to be thinking about today. This amendment says that no state, unlike the Due Process Clause in the Fifth Amendment, now we're talking about what states are prohibited from doing as opposed to the federal government. No state can deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law or deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And then the 15th Amendment prohibited denying the right to vote to anyone on the basis of race, color, or previous status as a slave. When we think about women in the 14th Amendment, historically, these Reconstruction Amendments were about race. They were not about sex. In fact, in 1868, when we had the 14th Amendment ratified, women did not yet have the right to vote in federal elections in the United States. That didn't come until 42 years later in 1920 when we ratified the 19th Amendment. Many women were able to vote in state elections prior to 1920, but it didn't become a federal right until 1920. Women didn't have the right to sit on a jury until 1975, over 100 years after the Equal Protection Clause. Again, many women did sit on juries in state courts, but it wasn't a guaranteed right until well after the 14th Amendment. Despite this, the Equal Protection Clause has become one of the main vehicles that we use to address sex discrimination in the US. So let's look at a couple more examples. What does it mean to be denied equal protection of the laws? How do we understand this constitutional protection? Well, basically it means when the government treats you differently than other people because of your race, sex, ethnicity, or other characteristic. Because of that characteristic, you are being denied equal protection of the laws. So then we have to ask, well, when can the government treat someone differently based on race, in case, sex, ethnicity, or other characteristics? Well, to put it very simply, the government can treat people differently based on these categories if they have a really good reason for the different treatment. So a really good reason really depends on who the government is treating differently. So, for example, what we usually do in the United States is we look at the differential treatment and we try to understand who is being treated differently. And we balance that with the government's reason. When the government is treating someone differently based on race, we apply a strict scrutiny standard to understanding whether that's an allowable differential treatment. And that standard requires that the government show that they're treating people differently on the basis of race because it's necessary to a compelling government interest and there's no less onerous alternative available. This is a very difficult standard for the government to meet, and race-based classifications are almost completely prohibited in the United States. It's almost impossible for the government to justify a race-based classification. But we're thinking today about sex discrimination. So when the government discriminates on the basis of sex, we apply intermediate scrutiny. And what intermediate scrutiny requires is the government show that it's treating women differently because that differential treatment is substantially related to an important government interest. So generally, this requires that the government provide an exceedingly persuasive justification for its different treatment. It's a lower standard than strict scrutiny, and it's easier for the government to meet. And then we have other classifications, such as alienage, which is citizenship. There's lots of other categories, other classifications that fit in this category of rational basis scrutiny. Rational basis scrutiny is the lowest standard applied to government differential treatment. And if the government wants to treat people differently on the basis of alienage or citizenship, all it has to show is that its differential treatment is rationally related to furthering a legitimate and permissive government interest. So this would be an easy standard for the government to meet. So you see that what qualifies as a good reason for the government to treat people differently depends on who the government is treating differently. What classification are they using for their differential treatment? So let's look at some examples of sex discrimination. The first example in one of the main seminal cases in the US is Gottsart v. Cleary. This is a 1948 case. In this case, the state of Michigan passed an ordinance prohibiting women from working as bartenders unless they were in the bar owner's family. This went all the way up to the US Supreme Court, and the US Supreme Court said, this is okay. They said that the state identified moral and social problems associated with having female bartenders, and that this was enough of a justification to allow prohibiting females to bartend. Another example of a seminal case in the US with regard to sex discrimination is the Reed v. Reed case in 1971. In that case, the state of Idaho had a law that when someone died and there was both a female and a male that were wanting to administer that person's estate, that the probate court had to give preference to the male. The US Supreme Court said this violated the Equal Protection Clause because it was treating men and women who were similarly situated differently without a good justification. Another example is the Frontiero v. Richardson case. This is a 1973 case, and this falls under the Fifth Amendment Due Process Clause as opposed to the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause because we were dealing with alleged federal sex discrimination. Same test, same standards. In this case, a federal law allowed male military members to claim their wives as dependents without financial proof that their wife, in fact, depended on them for her financial needs, but required that female military members prove their husband was a dependent by showing that over half of his financial support was reliant on his wife before she could claim him as a dependent. And the federal government said this was a administrative convenience that they needed to do this because there were so many male members that to have all of those male members prove their spouse's dependency would be administratively inconvenient. And the court said that administrative convenience was not enough of a justification for this equal protection issue, ultimately showing that we had a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. So now that we understand how the court balances the justification with the classification or the different treatment, let's look at an example. So say you have Melinda. She's a female student in a public charter school. It has to be public because you only have constitutional rights vis-a-vis government actors, whether state, local government, or federal. The school's dress code says all female students must refrain from wearing excessive jewelry and makeup. Female students must keep their shoulders and knees covered at all times, including during athletic events. Male students may only wear shorts during participation in athletic events. The school's justification for this is preservation of traditions and avoidance of unnecessary distractions. So in this hypothetical situation, we have to ask, does this violate the Equal Protection Clause? And to ask that and answer that question, we say, who does this policy treat differently? Well, you can see that the policy treats female students differently than male students. How does it do this? Well, it does it in a couple different ways. First, it says female students can't wear excessive jewelry or makeup. Second, it requires that their shoulders and knees be covered. So what's the school's reason for this differential treatment? We see that we have differential treatment. Now we need to look at the reason for the differential treatment. In this case, the school's reason is preservation of tradition and avoidance of unnecessary distractions. Now, I kind of want to know a little bit more about this case. What are some other facts that you'd want to know in order to do this analysis? Well, I'd want to know, can male students wear excessive jewelry and makeup? Can male students show their shoulders and knees? Do the shorts that male students can wear, can they be above their knees or do they have to be below their knees? And really important to me for this analysis would be, does this policy create a disadvantage for female students when they're engaging in athletics? And then we're going to balance this differential treatment of female students against the school's justification. We're going to ask, is the school's justification substantially related to an important government interest? Part of this analysis is asking whether preservation of tradition and avoidance of unnecessary distraction is an exceedingly persuasive justification for this differential treatment. Trying to understand, what is the goal of the government here, and is this differential treatment related to this goal? If yes, if the government's goal is exceedingly persuasive justification, then you do not have an equal protection violation. But if the government's justification is not exceedingly persuasive, then you do have an equal protection violation because you are depriving female students of equal protection of the laws without adequate justification. So that's just a quick introduction to sex discrimination under US law. I look forward to working with you. Thank you.